before the WWF SmackDowns and wrestling matches with all kinds of characters and stuff, we had these kaiju, and that's basically what we'll be talking about this week. John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi.
So the first one in the 1969 Destroy All Monsters. It's interesting how there's a lot of this space theme to it. I think what we're really seeing is like kind of this 60s optimism for space that was carried over from the 50s and stuff. Apparently, the prediction was that by 1999 we'd have daily moon flights. So quite a lot of optimism, considering that that was the year that we had just finally landed on the moon and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if Elon Musk is right, it could be another 5 years, and maybe we'll be doing maybe not daily flights, but regular flights. Who knows? But
right.
Yeah, and we always expect quite a lot more with our future predictions, especially when looking at the 50s or the 60s. But it's interesting you mentioned that in terms that, Destroy All Monsters had the optimism of space travel from the 60s, but I think at the same time it has the pessimism of feminism.
That's right.
That's kind of what I got out of Destroy All Monsters. And I should say in this comparison, we've taken 2019's King of Monsters versus, we tried to find something that was like fairly close, and Destroy All Monsters, it's probably one of the more famous 60s era kaiju movies, I guess, but there isn't really a like for like comparison. It was either this or the first Ghidorah movie, but we chose this one, I guess, because we wanted to, I think, rather randomly.
Yeah. And it's funny how, I guess they have this Monsterland, which is apparently, kind of before Jurassic Park, this place that you contain all your monsters and stuff. And everything seems to work to some degree fine, that they finally, I guess, Japan and the world had finally contained the monster problem until, of course, that they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, again, like you said, with the optimism of space travel and technology, I think that's very much expressed in this idea that each of the monsters represent some sort of natural threat at a fairly superficial level. So this is like, this domination of nature. They've managed to contain them all on this island, at least for now. And I mean, other people say that Monsterland kind of represents the Pacific, more or less, and its resources, with, depending on your interpretation, Ghidorah or Godzilla representing foreign powers coming in, trying to sort of take it. Yeah, it's interesting nonetheless that they're all on this. They've managed to have them all on one island.
Yeah, and overall, I think this movie has very much a 60s kind of sci-fi feel. I tell you, what's called, you gotta love kind of some of the lines in the movie. The one was, but Monsterland is so close, why wasn't Tokyo attacked? I'd like to know that myself.
Yeah.
And then the gentleman, I guess, who was in charge says, "Now, please excuse me, I'm tired," in the middle of a press conference.
Wish I could do that. Yeah,
right.
Somebody doing a presentation. Yeah, I'm tired now. See you later. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was quite interesting. I mean, you've got sort of a similar, fairly superficial theme to the remake, in that some outside foreign force comes in and makes these otherwise benign, or now kind of tamed forces of nature suddenly let loose and start attacking various cities in the world. So this idea of a foreign sort of entity coming in and ruining the natural balance of things, so to speak, we'll say.
And like you said, it's funny how these aliens, strangely enough, have a female appearance and stuff.
Yes, they're all female.
I think there's something about the culture that, I don't know myself, to be honest, but we saw this even in the Japanese horror, where a lot of times the ghosts are female and stuff, and it's I can't say for sure why it is that like these whether it's monsters or the kind of ghosts and stuff that they have this kind of female representation.
Well, I think it's to do with emotional the sort of emotionality because if you remember with the ghost stories, it's the ghosts have an emotional tie to the material world that brings them back.
Right.
And I guess there's this view that women are more emotional, and they have and that's what creates this danger to the natural order. I mean, that's kind of how I could more or less rename this Destroy All Feminists rather than Destroy All Monsters, because you've got an unknown, this feminine power that is manipulating people's minds. These Venusians, they're from and this is another thing of heat and emotion in terms of Japanese movies. They're from a hot planet, and in order to make them, more pacified, they have to be cooled down from their natural sort of state, and then they kind of become these little static rocks and slither away into them. It's sort of like this sort of evil race of women who have the ability to unleash chaos and control people's minds, that they have to be just cool them down, just stop being so emotional and you'll be okay. That was kind of how I interpreted that, which I suppose the threat of, and you can see that as maybe not directly a threat of feminism itself, but the foreign influences from the US and Europe having an effect probably on the women of Japan in the 60s.
I mean, that's something that even in my own culture, the Chinese, that you're kind of raised that way, that you're to be very stoic. We probably the stereotype, the cliche is about the Asian calmness and stuff like that. And I guess that's a lot of the Eastern kind of approach to things, that like you should have a very stoic approach to life. You should not be flustered, you should not let emotions get the better of you, stuff like that. But yet, here's the ironic part too: is like if we see over and over again in these movies and stuff, and even in Seven Samurai, where you had these stoic samurai, stuff like that. But the villagers and everything, like any scene, typically with them, they're so emotional, we're doomed, like, and it's not just like kind of like they're upset, they're like really upset, they're like like, oh my god, what are we gonna do, like kind of just yelling and screaming and ranting.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right with Seven Samurai, because it's like the villagers are seen as weak and that weakness has this emotional stuff tied with it. And likewise, I can't remember his name, but the main guy, I can't remember his name now, but he's crazy because he's so kind of outspoken and loud, but also kind of entertaining at the same way. So it's kind of like, yeah, there is definitely some sort of tie to both of it there. I mean, and I like this. There was one quote from the Venusians. They're sort of trying to do a bit of kind of scientific analysis of them, and they're saying, but how did they get this way? It must have taken them thousands of years to get this far, and heat up to this power level. I thought that was just an interesting thing to say.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like it was just simply the different lines like that, and just also we also have this kind of again, like stoic kind of leader, right, Captain Otani, and he's kind of has that kind of rugged look. I mean, granted, he's Japanese and stuff like that, but he could just as easily from when we were watching like The Right Stuff, or I kind of had that classic jar line, I guess, of these 60s military leaders and stuff.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing about this movie is the way technology is positioned in it, because you have the Venusians have got technology that makes them cleverer per se, and that they can manipulate animals and things like this. But it's really the Earth being's powerful laser that wins the day just by being more powerful. So it's kind of like power trumps intelligence in a way,
right,
in the way that technology is positioned in this movie.
Yeah, and that definitely I think really goes with like kind of the thing that we've seen, because and I think also in the Japanese culture, different times it's about your authority, like pretty much part of like it's embedded in the language, it's embedded to kind of the bowing stuff. Like if you are a more of a like in the Godzilla terms, if you were apex kind of person in the room and stuff, that everyone bows lower to you, and so there's a lot of that, like kind of like who's the apex predator in the room and stuff.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's what's for me, that that's what's interesting to see with this struggle that happens in Destroy All Monsters, in that it's a combination of the sort of powerful laser, and ultimately it's the monsters, which are a force of nature, kind of destroying the Venusians. And so it's you can almost read that as this is the balance of nature coming in and correcting the Venusians' behavior, if you will, if you wanted to be that way inclined. But yeah.
And it's funny how like the monsters, even though that like in the other movies they're like kind of like you said, this force that's kind of out of control, and then now for pretty much in this movie they're the force that like is just basically used, like kind of it's either are used, like kind of as the Earth or whatever, or these aliens kind of like using them. And so like they're kind of like this they go from being like the apex predators and being in charge of like kind of these force of nature and stuff like that, to being an instrument of policy, if you will, and stuff.
Yeah, there's some people who attribute that as some of the monsters, especially in this movie, can represent, as I said, resources. You could look at it as Japan versus China versus the US using the resources around the Pacific, or who has the right to use them responsibly. It's another way of looking at it. So, I mean, I think when you actually get into what each of the monsters represent, that's quite interesting, because each of them have had their own movie. So this is kind of like a grand slam in a way, that it had all of them in it. But yeah, I mean, Mothra is quite an interesting one, because I think I don't actually know if there's a specific kind of Shinto or other symbol thing for a moth, but I mean, it's intriguing from the Western perspective, because we don't really give moths much kind of credence over here. Right. And I mean, I think from what I understand of the various Godzilla movies, Mothra represents a kind of a death and rebirth, because it's a caterpillar. But it's very much a kind of she's a sort of a benevolent goddess, sort of harmony with nature, kind of balance of nature style sort of representation.
A female, but an acceptable one for some reason.
Yeah. With again, the kind of psychic power over those two weird sort of fairy twins that pop up and
right
just sing and things like this, which is kind of odd. But yeah, so Mothra is definitely an interesting one. Rodan, I don't know. I mean, some people say that either Rodan or Anguilla represents the threat of USSR during, or the Cold War during that period. I'm not entirely sure myself, to be honest with you. I think I mean, Rodan's obviously the one that is more interesting, because he has fire powers rather than just spikes. But likewise, Ghidorah seems a fairly sort of standard representation of chaos. But some people say that's linked to old depictions of Russian dragons, or it's tied to Yamato no Orochi, which is an 8-headed dragon in Japanese culture. Yeah, I mean, obviously he's a space creature, so he obviously represents some kind of external threat. That's really the main thing I got from it.
And then I guess what is also interesting is that between this and the US one that we'll be getting into, is that even though that like that it's the name Destroy All Monsters makes it sound like that like kind of like a free-for-all between the monsters and the world, and to some degree it was, but it was like the aliens had them, sent out to these different cities to kind of just ravage them, and then they, I guess, ultimately converged back on Japan and stuff like that. So I thought that was kind of like an interesting kind of aspect of like the dynamics of the overall, like, the plan, I guess, if you will, and stuff, versus like thinking in the U.S. one that we'll be getting to, it's kind of more, I don't know, like they kind of more of a focused attack, it seems, and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, unless you got, I don't know, did you want to talk about Destroy All Monsters anymore? Well, because it might be a good time to shift on to the 2019 remake.
Yeah, I think definitely we're starting getting into the let's call it the similarities and stuff like that. So yeah, might as well, I guess, dive into that one then.
Because for me, I started asking myself this question. We looked at Godzilla, the remake from 1999, and it didn't spawn a new franchise. It wasn't a huge hit or anything like that. And I started to sort of ask myself, what is it about the new Godzilla movies that have kind of, the audiences have identified with, or what kind of, changes could there be that would actually make these successful? And I started looking at, I started getting the idea that actually, based on watching Destroy All Monsters, if you're viewing feminism as a social threat or something that might sort of upset the social balance, you could look at monster movies as a representation of social unrest. And lo and behold, when you look at the data for the US, social unrest was at fairly low levels all through the 90s, the early 2000s. And it's really only around about 2010 that, the numbers start kind of ticking up. And, lo and behold, 2014 marks the first time you had 4 or 5 incidents in a year. And pretty much from then on, 2016 was a real high point, I guess, with the election and various other things. There was 15 kind of events of social unrest, but then, 5 or more events per year have been pretty much the norm since then, with 2020 marking an all-time high. And so I think there's definitely a link between social unrest and us viewing, macro problems in society as monsters that can't be tamed, or have to have equally, undesirable counter effects to balance them out and things. So that's almost like a kaiju showdown there.
No, that's a great point, though. Like I hadn't thought about that, about like kind of different times. What is like kind of, whether consciously or subconsciously, what is like kind of, this force that's like kind of out of control and stuff like that that's going on.
Yeah, and forces we don't necessarily understand fully at the time.
Right.
You could say that protests or social unrests or sort of riots and things like that, that's perhaps the monstrous part of or the uncontrollable part of our personalities coming out and unleashing itself on the world. Or perhaps, as we've said previously, this could tie into that sci-fi trope of wanting to watch the world burn. There's a certain satisfaction in seeing a monster just walk its way through a skyscraper. But I think definitely there's it's interesting that there is, you can almost correlate them quite closely. But this year Kong versus Godzilla was probably the biggest grossing movie, and one of the few that people actually went out of their way during the lockdown or restrictions to go and see. So that was kind of an interesting one for me.
I think that fear of or that feeling of, like kind of like I said, of having these things that are so out of control happening and stuff like that is like kind of pretty much mirrors like, these movies where these buildings are kind of collapsing and people are running and there's chaos and stuff like that. I think it's kind of similar to how in the 50s, these monster movies were big. And then, meanwhile you had like, the Cold War that like kind of was happening, that like, it's more like it was always something that was on the horizon. That was something on the edge and stuff like that, that like was happening, even though that like there was no, although you did have the Korean War and like kind of that was like a quote unquote hot war and stuff like that, but in Vietnam, like in the 60s, but it was still always something I think just like over the horizon that wasn't quite in your backyard and stuff.
Yeah, and maybe that's it. It's more of a it's this danger of either an unknown or foreign macro issue that you can't quite get your head around. Because if you look at the 70s, most of the movies there weren't any monster movies really, and everything was based on criminal, much more kind of closer to home problems in society.
Yeah.
So I mean, I also think it's interesting, this idea that it's king of the monsters. It's like, who's the king? And I wonder if this kind of represents a people's feeling of a lack of sovereignty in a way, in that or people being displaced by inequality or something like this. Or that could just be me doing a bit of a overreach there, I suppose.
Well, I think the interesting part that we've talked about before is this idea of an apex predator, this kind of dominance and stuff like that. And I think that's like, even though that like we talk about equality, we talk about like kind of everyone getting along and stuff like that, but the thing is though that like in any given situation on a it's still kind of like a playground, and there's still like dominance, right? There's still like kind of the bullies, and there's still the people looking to kind of find where do they stack up, like kind of after like kind of the apex and stuff like that. And, like we have, of course, in the entertainment world, like you have stars and you have the B-listers, right, and stuff, and then never mind, of course, on the things like politics or political form and stuff like that. It's always about who's the one that's the majority leader, who's the one who's the minority leader. There's still like leaders even within the different groups and stuff like that. And I think that's the thing that anywhere you go, we're always kind of looking to see who's the dominant force and stuff in the room.
yeah I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I think obviously Godzilla wins. We don't know how to bring that up. I mean, I thought that the symbolism was fairly heavy-handed with Ghidorah, in that it's there's one scene where it's almost like they're sort of as a winged beast with a crucifix in the front, and it was like, this is kind of, and it's all flames everywhere. It's like, this is very kind of heavy-handed sort of satanic symbolism going on here with Ghidorah. I mean, I mean, again, we're looking at what is it? It's sort of, was it a nuclear power or nuclear tests or something triggers this? No, it's the scientist trying to find a way to communicate with the monsters that unleashes it, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's basically done in the interests of environmental. So with us sort of trying to balance nature, we inadvertently unleash it and destroy huge swathes of the civilization. I mean, I suppose in a way you could sort of say from the playbook, Mothra is one of the ones that's first introduced, and they're trying to communicate with it. So rather than Mothra kind of psychically communicating with people, you've got people trying to, acoustically communicate with it. And so maybe Millie Bobby Brown and her mum in this almost like the fairies or substitute fairies for the but they're certainly, they don't just sort of randomly appear and sing. They're pretty tough, and they can do all their action-packed scenes in this.
Yeah, it's the big thing here is this kind of environmental theme and stuff like that. That it's funny how as you're talking about with Vera Farmiga playing the mother and stuff, she's has this altruistic motivation to be part of the final solution, right? To kind of basically it's kind of like a final solution of where people are the problem stuff. We're the vermin that needs to be cleansed and stuff like that, and the monsters are the basically they are the ones that are going to do the cleaning, I guess, and stuff, and to bring them about is like kind of how that's going to happen, and I think overall too with the legendary approach is that like they seem to even though that like there's a lot of fresh things that they bring to it, like kind of in the first movie having basically Bryan Cranston as a lead character, stuff like that. But meanwhile, the a lot of the elements that they bring to it are, just like you said, this case it was like basically they did something that was like the story of monsters, and then of course as we'll see later on with the Kong vs Godzilla, they kind of pull a combination of like the two monsters kind of battling it out, but then they bring in spoiler alert, Mechagodzilla and stuff. So it's like kind of like, in other words, they're kind of just pulling the different things from the library shelf of these monster movies, and they're kind of like inserting whichever ones that like that they kind of want to kind of and then of course in this one with the King of Monsters, we have the oxygen destroyer again, which is a callback to the original.
Yeah, absolutely. That was interesting that they kind of referenced that and tried to use it against Godzilla and Ghidorah. And I mean, this is the first one they expand on this whole Hollow Earth thing as well, and they've got Godzilla's kind of regenerative temple home of. There's a bit of sort of ancient conspiracy theory stuff thrown in there as well.
Right.
They were all worshipped and things, which is superficially kind of interesting to see them floating through the temples. But it's I mean, I guess you can kind of see, because it's Mothra's call that brings him back to life somehow. And so, you can sort of say that us trying to interfere with nature is what causes the problem, even if we try and be benevolent, and it's just the natural forces sort of balancing themselves out, or having their own ecosystem that will sort of get rid of this terrible alien threat. But,
and we definitely don't have the same kind of association of Mothra being this kind of good feminine power versus kind of evil alien female power, I guess, and stuff.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, Mothra in this one is fairly benevolent, really. I don't think,
but more neutral though. I mean, this is slightly female kind of, association stuff, but it's not nearly as strong as in the original, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, there isn't really much apart from Rodan is really the only one that's really featured a lot in this as well. They sort of have little clips of other monsters that are somewhat recognizable as maybe connected to it, but none of the real famous sort of ones like Anguilla or something like that. But
yeah, I think one other thing to mention, besides Ken Watanabe and Sally Hawkins returning for a brief amount of stuff, unfortunately, they're what's called their fates are cut short, unfortunately. But the other one to mention was Kyle Chandler, who we last saw in the remake of King Kong and stuff, and who possibly one day we'll be seeing in Friday Night Lights as the father / husband of Vera Farmiga's character.
I thought it was interesting as well in this one, if I have got the right movie, because I watched a lot of Godzilla movies lately. But you had guy from Silicon Valley.
Oh yes.
As representing technology in this one.
Right.
I've got to try and find his name actually here really quickly.
Thomas Middleditch,
Yeah, Thomas Middleditch, there we go. And, it was interesting in this one, in that they portray the scientists as the clear, level-headed saviors, and the technologist was kind of like the person who's making it up as they go along and don't really understand anything. And, it's kind of, in some respects, a bit sort of anti-tech in that respect, in that the technologist is kind of more like the con man who's trying to sort of doesn't really understand things properly, but tries to sort of bluff people, whereas the scientists are the ones who really understand what's going on.
And as much as like the we see like kind of traditionally in these monster movies, the military weapons, right, are like of little use against the monsters and stuff. But they do still play a role, though. I mean, that's the thing that's interesting about the legendary version is that they do help to like to neutralize things. Even if they don't totally kill off the monsters and stuff.
Well, think about that in terms of political unrest, right, or social unrest. You need the army to come in and contain the threat, but they're not the solution, because that would be totalitarian, right? So, I mean, another interesting character to have in there was Bradley Whitford, who was I know best from West Wing. So he's it's quite a cerebral step down from West Wing to the monsters, but he had some he was supposed to be the US sort of scientific expert.
Right.
I thought it was interesting that the Japanese scientist has to sacrifice himself in order to give life back to Godzilla. I thought that was a kind of interesting take on that. And I mean, Charles Dance as the kind of eco-terrorist.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose there've been plenty of protests in England and various other places in Europe. When you think of the environmental protests, the sort of extinction rebellion stuff we've had, you can kind of see this represented by these environmentalists gone mad and unleashing something they hadn't realized.
And it's a really kind of ironic thing, right? Because we tend to think of folks who are more into the environment and ecology, like kind of the quote unquote the tree huggers and stuff, but yet like the term eco-terrorist, like kind of it's kind of like really like almost like an oxymoron, or like kind of it's really and different times though they invariably in these movies they're always the ones that kind of really trigger like kind of these worst effects and stuff. And because here in this one, of course, they unleash these monsters in the 28 Days Later series and stuff like that, which we may be talking about at some point. They kind of unleash this kind of zombie, or kind of ravaging horde and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's sign of the times, I guess. I mean, although what isn't a sign of the times is something that unfortunately is something we see all too often. You've got O'Shea Jackson Jr. as a black character who simplifies things for people, plot points. He's like,
right.
If we got any nuclear bombs left, and they say, what are we going to do? They're going to blow up a bong and bring him back to life. Thanks for pointing that out. Thanks for simplifying that for us.
Right.
Pretty cynical, really. I mean, there's a lot of famous people in this movie. You've got Ziyi Zhang in there as Dr. Chen, as
the token Chinese representation. So then that way we get on the screens there in Beijing.
I know, right? Yeah. So a lot of sort of fairly famous sort of people in there. I mean, it's as I say, it's when you view these through the lens of social unrest, they take on kind of a more sort of interesting meaning in general, for me at least, anyway. And I think we'll see more of that in Godzilla versus Kong as well.
Yes.
As there's I've been thinking a lot more about Kong Skull Island since I've watched it, and I'll sort of I'll start referencing that in next week's one. But
what do you think overall though about how Legendary like has handled like kind of their, like you said, the myth building, and I feel like the different movies, like kind of they do kind of just kind of like the whole thing with the Marvel universe and the DC and all that kind of stuff, that they do want you to kind of watch each of the other movies to understand more of what's going on. But at the same time, they are somewhat, they are standalone enough. They're so relatively self-contained that like this one has the whole thing going on with of course this Kyle Chandler and Vera Farmiga's the couple, their kind of drama, stuff like that with the daughter, and it's like totally separate from the the previous one where Bryan Cranston and his son, and the kind of the things going on there and everything.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've started viewing that kind of thing as parents and kids, and they're often kids who, well, they're not really kids, they're sort of young adults or well-established adults. It's really a kind of generational difference I see in that, you know, you've got Bryan Cranston trying his best, but ultimately failing at destroying this monster, and it's really left in the hands of, you know, that your millennial kind of hero to do it. And likewise in this one, you know, you've got Millie Bobby Brown as someone who's got to sort of go the extra mile and almost sort of sacrifices herself in order to curtail this monster that was actually created by her parents.
Right.
You know, if you're talking about that in sort of economic terms or political terms, you know, I think that, you know, that represents that sort of divide in society.
Yeah, and I can see how, like, different times there is the feeling though that, like, you know, the kids and, you know, the millennial generation, right? They're you know, like, basically left to clean up the mess of, you know, kind of the 50s and 60s, right? The consumerism and the things that the ecological, environmental damage that was done, you know, from that.
Or economic debt, you know, you look at the debt clock of the US, and, you know, whenever you hear an economist, an old economist talking about this, they just say, oh, well, you know, I feel sorry for the kids. They're the ones who are going to have to sort of burden the brunt of all this debt or this easy money that's been created. So I think there is this feeling that, you know, millennials will be shouldering both the burden of debt and the ecological, you know, debt as well, which has been. So yeah,
I mean, in some ways, those are the monsters, right? Of you know, like that these future generations have to live with, and they're trying to tame and, you know, trying to communicate or trying to understand and stuff.
Yeah, various people of an older generation trying to tame natural forces unsuccessfully, I guess, or you could look at that as resource allocation around the world or something like that. Yeah.
But meanwhile, like, they're kind of there's some hope, I guess, in the younger generation having better understanding, better ways to deal with it and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and then there was sort of just because I watched it recently, and I'm going off topic here, but I watched the sort of Falcon and Winter Soldier, and I kind of feel that's very much a kind of political show, in that you've got these sort of slightly older generation, black and white sort of men trying to sort of work out how they settle their differences and find their identities, versus a mixed race millennial sort of threat who uses all these anarchic technological kind of systems to sort of get around the military and break the rules and things like this. I thought, yeah, right, that's on the nose, isn't it? But anyway, yeah. So I think, you know, and it's, you know, it's in this one, Millie Bobby Brown's got to kind of think up interesting new solutions, and work outside of, you know, the standard way of doing things to stop the threat.
Speaking of Millie Bobby Brown, I'm a big fan of course, you know, the Stranger Things series and stuff. What's your prediction on whether one day we'll be having a remake of that series?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Totally, yeah.
So we'll have we're having a kind of remake, thing of film that, or excuse me, a series that is about the retro look at the 80s. And
it'll be in a totally different format though. It'll be in a series of like meta dance-offs by various people in like a scripted TikTok dance-off in VR or something like this. Something almost completely devoid of meaning. No, I'm being very cynical there, but yeah. Yeah. So yes. Can we scrape any more kind of social commentary out of King of the Monsters?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall it's similar to you know, like the previous ones where like basically a lot of action, a lot of like you know, like it's a little bit more commentary, a little bit more theme, but it's yeah. I mean, I think they're, you know, overall they're kind of if anything, they're probably going to go more away from that, and I feel like that's what we'll see in the Kong versus Godzilla movie and stuff like that. That or Godzilla versus Kong, that we kind of like just are going back to the action and like kind of deal a lot less with themes, a lot less with characters and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of character building in this, and there is quite a lot of action. I mean, I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was quite entertaining, really. I mean, a lot more so than the 2014 one, Godzilla, which had them just tracking Godzilla for half the movie. This one, you've actually got quite a lot of, creatures fighting each other and things like this, which generally made it better, I thought. I mean, I would say I did enjoy Destroy All Monsters purely because once I kind of got the feminist kind of angle in my head, I just found it hilarious to watch. But yeah, I would say definitely that was better for amusement, and the 2019 was better for action, I suppose.
Cool. So yeah, we'll be continuing on with the series. As mentioned, that we'll be looking at the Godzilla versus King Kong, the ultimate match. Once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Nedmans. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.